Artistic treatment of a 3D render is a common compositing task, and I want to go over a few of the popular treatment techniques, but understand that this is extremely subjective, so there isn't necessarily a correct treatment or a wrong treatment, but rather what looks good versus what looks bad, and however you get there is up to your personal preference. But often we'll want to adjust the colors, so first I want to make some room for a color adjustment node. I'll hit Shift A and go into the color section where we have many tools at your disposal. I'm going to go with the color balance node and I'll plug that in right after the defocus. We'll move that down and I'm going to move my backdrop to the upper corner by holding Alt and middle mouse clicking. You can see our offset values up here have been adjusted. And now with the color balance node, this first color wheel adjusts the dark areas of our image. So I might add some blue tint in there so that we see our shadows get a little more blue. Maybe raise the value up just a little. There we go, kind of brightens up the image. And then for our gamma, let's go the other direction to the warm spectrum. Maybe a little more saturation. Yeah, something like that. Maybe that's a little bit too much. And then the gain value, we'll leave the color where it's at and simply drag the value up. There we go, pretty simple. We can mute this node on and off to see the adjustment. And yeah, that's just a little more crisp. I think that's a decent color treatment. We also have an RGB curves node that's in the same color category, RGB curves, and it can be used in conjunction with our color balance to darken the darks, brighten the brights, to add a little more contrast, or we can go into the RG and B channels individually to adjust the curves, or we can see what that looks like without the color balance, muting that on and off. But overall, I think I like the color balance by itself best. Anyway, you can play around with all of these color nodes. You've already seen the hue, saturation, and value. Brightness and contrast is another common one. But I'm going to leave that color treatment as it is and move on to another treatment technique, which is called a vignette. And the purpose of a vignette is to draw attention to a specific area of the image. And to achieve this, we want to add from the matte category an ellipse mask. So we'll plug that in to our viewer node with Shift-Control-Click. And you can see that it's basically a circle. We can adjust the size here in the node. I'll make this one fairly circular and maybe move it over to the left just a little bit because that's where my orb is and I want to draw attention to that orb so that it works with the defocus node. And after the ellipse, I want to add a filter blur node. And we'll change the operation to fast Gaussian. And now the X and Y values determine the amount of blur in each direction. So let's bump that up to, let's say, 50 and 50. And then the size value at the bottom is kind of an overall blur strength. So we'll bump that up to 5. Now we're getting much more blur. How about 8? I think that's pretty good. And now I want to mix this into our color treated version of the composition with a color mix node. And now the blur output goes in that bottom socket. And let's Shift-Control-Click on this reroute node so we see the result. We're using the mix operation at a factor of 1, which means 100% the second input. Instead, let's use the overlay operation. And if we turn that on and off with the M mute hotkey, notice that the center of the image stays a little more consistent as far as colors, both saturation and value, but then along the edges where our vignette mask is darker, that will both saturate the color and darken the color of the image underneath. And so that's how we get this kind of burning effect. And at a value of 1, that's maybe a little too strong. Let's go to 0.5. Turn that on and off. There we go. It is very subtle, but that's the kind of vignette that I like. Oftentimes you'll see instead of overlay, we'll use the multiply operation and then maybe tone down the blur a little bit. Let's go to 5, maybe even like 2. And then if we crank up the factor all the way up at 1, this is a very extreme example of what the vignette is meant to do by darkening everything except what we want to focus on. So really we want to tone that way down to like 0.5, maybe 0.7. Again, personally, I like the overlay method, but this is very much your preference. And so after the vignette, the last treatment technique I want to show you involves the lens distortion node in our distort category. The second option, lens distortion. And what this simulates is camera effects, like noise, for example. If we turn on jitter, you should be able to notice the subtle film grain that's been overlaid. I'll turn that on and off. And below that we have distort. If I turn that on to 0.1, this is a very sensitive setting. You'll see that our image begins to distort, like photos are distorted due to the camera lens. And to take care of these black corners, I need to enable fit, and that will ensure that the resolution of our image fills the frame. And finally, dispersion, if we turn that on to 0.1 as well, that's another camera effect that slightly separates the RG and B channels. Overall, this node is meant to simulate a camera lens, hopefully enabling more photorealistic final results. But the ironic thing about this is the more extreme these effects are, the lower quality the camera is. And so in reality, the higher quality the camera, the less noise you'll get, the less distortion and less dispersion you'll get. So I highly encourage you to be subtle with this node. I actually don't use distortion as my personal preference and turn the dispersion way down to like 0.03. And as for jitter, that's just depending on the project, whether or not I want that on. And that's just a few of the treatment techniques that are possible with the compositor. Now that you know the fundamentals, your next step should be to further explore the compositor's features, get familiar with the available nodes, and figure out how to artistically enhance your renders.